The Cabin in the Whispering Pines. Last summer, my friends and I decided to take a break from our busy lives and booked a remote cabin deep in the heart of the Whispering Pines National Forest. The listing on Airbnb promised a serene getaway far from the hustle and bustle of city life. It looked perfect in the photos, nestled among towering pine trees. We arrived on a sunny afternoon, greeted by the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. The cabin looked just like the pictures, rustic and charming. The host, a friendly elderly man named Mr. Jenkins, welcomed us warmly and gave us a quick tour. He mentioned that his family had owned the property for generations, and the cabin had been around for nearly a century. First night was peaceful. We sat around a roaring fire, sharing stories and sipping hot cocoa. But as the night grew darker, we started hearing strange noises outside. Whispers in the wind, eerie footsteps, and faint, distant cries. We shrugged it off as our imagination playing tricks on us. The next day, we decided to explore the forest. The trees were tall and dense, creating an eerie twilight even in the middle of the day. We stumbled upon an old, abandoned graveyard hidden deep in the woods. The gravestones covered in moss and barely legible. Mr. Jenkins later explained that these were the final resting places of his ancestors. Things took a sinister turn that night. We woke to find strange symbols etched onto the cabin's walls. They seemed ancient, like something from another time. None of us had seen them before, and we couldn't fathom how they had appeared overnight. The whispers in the forest grew louder, like a chorus of ghosts. We decided to leave, but as we packed up, the cabin seemed to fight back. Doors slammed shut on their own, and the windows wouldn't budge. Panic set in as we realized we were trapped. We begged Mr. Jenkins for help, but when we looked for him, he had vanished. The night dragged on, and the whispers became deafening. We huddled together, trembling with fear, as the walls of the cabin seemed to close in around us. Just when we thought we couldn't take it anymore, the sun broke over the horizon. With the first light of day, the cabin released its grip, and we rushed out, leaving everything behind. We never saw Mr. Jenkins again, and when we reported the incident to the authorities, they couldn't find any record of him. The Whispering Pines National Forest had no record of the cabin or the graveyard either. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that remote cabin. But one thing's for sure, I'll never book an Airbnb in the middle of nowhere again. My night in a Paris horror story. I was so excited to book my first Airbnb. I had been saving up for months for a trip to Europe, and I couldn't wait to experience the local culture. I found a beautiful apartment in Paris, and the pictures looked amazing. The host had great reviews, and I was feeling confident that I had made a good choice. When I arrived at the apartment, I was immediately disappointed. It was nothing like the pictures. The furniture was old and outdated, and the walls were stained. There was a strange smell in the air, and I couldn't quite place it. I tried to ignore it, but it was hard. I decided to unpack and get settled in. As I was unpacking, I noticed a few things that made me even more uneasy. There were strange symbols carved into the walls, and the bed sheets were covered in dust. I started to feel like I was being watched. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing noises outside my door, and I was convinced that someone was in the apartment with me. I finally fell asleep around 3 a.m., but I was woken up a few hours later by a loud crash. I jumped out of bed and ran to the living room, but there was no one there. I was starting to panic. I didn't know what to do. I called the host, but he didn't answer. I tried to call Airbnb, but their customer service line was closed. I was all alone, and I didn't know who to turn to. I finally decided to leave the apartment and go for a walk. I needed to clear my head and figure out what to do. As I was walking, I saw a police officer. I ran up to him and told him what had happened. He took me back to the apartment and called the landlord. The landlord came and checked out the apartment. He said that he had never seen anything like it before. He offered to let me stay in a different apartment, but I was too shaken up. I just wanted to go home. I ended up canceling my trip and flying back to the US. I was so traumatized by the experience that I didn't stay in an Airbnb again for years. I still don't know what happened that night in Paris. I can only imagine that the apartment was haunted. But whatever it was enough to make me never want to stay in an Airbnb again. The haunted Victorian mansion. Last summer, my friends and I decided to take a trip to the historic town of Ravenswood. We found a charming Victorian mansion on Airbnb that promised an authentic experience from a bygone era. The photos showcased a grand old house with ornate details and antique furniture. It seemed perfect. Upon arrival, the mansion was even more impressive than the pictures. The host, a soft-spoken elderly woman named Mrs. Thornton, greeted us warmly. She explained that the house had been in her family for generations and was rumored to be haunted, but she assured us it was just local folklore. First night was peaceful. We marveled at the mansion's vintage decor, with its creaky wooden floors and elaborate chandeliers. But as the night fell, we began to hear strange sounds. Footsteps echoing in empty hallways, whispers in the darkness, and doors that slammed shut on their own. We brushed it off at first, thinking it was just an old house settling. But things escalated quickly. Objects moved on their own. Paintings shifted, and we heard faint, mournful cries from the empty rooms. One evening, we even saw a shadowy figure in a long, tattered gown glide down the grand staircase. We decided to confront Mrs. Thornton about these eerie occurrences. She reluctantly admitted that her ancestors had dabbled in the occult and that some of their experiments might have left lingering spirits behind. She warned us to leave the house immediately, but it was easier said than done. As we packed our bags, the mansion seemed to come alive. The chandeliers swayed ominously, and the temperature plummeted. Doors slammed shut, trapping us in the foyer. We could hear whispers all around us, growing louder and more desperate. In a moment of sheer terror, we managed to force the front door open and fled into the night. The mansion seemed to sigh in relief as we crossed the threshold. We reported the incident to Airbnb, but they had no record of Mrs. Thornton or the mansion. It was as if it had never existed, whether it was a ghostly encounter or just an elaborate hoax. I can't say for sure, but one thing's certain. I won't be staying in any more Victorian mansions, especially not ones with a dark history.